Hi everybody, I'm Mike McCrory and this is Would You Make It? Last year, a little before Christmas, a client emailed me out of the blue and asked if I could make him a coat rack and a key rack as a special gift for his girlfriend's family. He had a design in mind using exotic woods that we tweaked a little bit as we emailed back and forth. After the design was finalized, my job was to execute. So let's get started. I figured I was going to have to glue up some curly maple boards to get something large enough, but I was lucky to find this slab of highly figured curly maple at an exotic lumber place that I frequent. I also got some pieces of 8/4 cocobolo for the frame. The curly maple has a bit of a cup, so I'll take it over to my CNC router to flatten the top. I'm using a flattening bit that's 1 1/8 inches in diameter. The slab was about 9 feet long and about 2 feet wide. I had to cut it to be able to transport it, but that worked out well because I needed a piece that's about 24 inches by 36 inches to make this coat rack. I cut the piece to be about 40 inches long, and my CNC is not quite large enough to do the entire length, so I had to do it in 2 passes. Next, I'll cut one edge to be straight, and then I'll cut the 2 ends to size using my table saw sled. I had initially cut this piece to be 40 inches long, but I only need 32 inches, so I'll save this offcut for a later step. Next, I'll run it through my drum sander with the flat side down so that the other side will be flat and parallel to the side that I just flattened. The cocobolo is a little curved, so I'll fix that by running it through my jointer. I cut the piece with the biggest curve in half for the end pieces so that I wouldn't have to joint it so much and end up with pieces that were too narrow. And then I ran the cocobolo through the planer to bring it down to the desired thickness of about 1 5/8 inches. Next, I use my bandsaw to resaw the cocobolo to get a slice that's about 1/4 inch thick that I will use to create some inlay. And then I ran it through the drum sander to get it to a consistent thickness along the entire length. Using my CNC router with a 15-degree V-bit, I carved the male inlay for the names for the 5 family members. And then I used a 1/8 inch end mill to clear out all the waste. Next, I used that same 15-degree V-bit to carve the female portion of the names into the curly maple slab. Next, I cut out the male inlays and then glued them in place. And then I clamped them down with enough pressure so that they would remain well seated. The next day, after the glue had dried, I sanded away the excess material to reveal the names. Next, I cut the frame pieces to be 2.5 inches wide. I also cut some thinner strips to be used as edge banding around the shelf. Then I cut another piece of that slab because I needed a piece of curly maple for the shelf. Also, the client wanted the curly maple to appear as if it was 2 inches thick, so I cut some smaller strips that I will glue around the outside edge of the back side to make it appear as if the whole thing is thicker than it really is. I'm using that first offcut to cut the 2 end pieces. I also need 1 piece of inlay using curly maple, so I cut a strip that is 1/4 of an inch thick so that I can carve the male portion on the CNC. While the CNC is working, I prepared the edge banding for the shelf using Cocobolo that is about 3/4 of an inch thick. The shelf is about 7 inches deep, so I needed 2 short pieces that are about 8 inches long with a 45-degree miter, and 1 long piece that I will glue to the front edge of the shelf. 8 inches is longer than I need, but it helps to have a little excess that I can cut off after the glue up. I glued on the first piece and then test fit the remaining 2 pieces. Before gluing them into place, I needed to carve the female portion of the inlay into the Cocobolo edge band that goes along the front. And this will hold the family's last name. While that's working away, I glued on those pieces of curly maple that will give the slab its apparent thickness, making sure that I have the grain oriented in the right direction. Everything needs to be end grain on the outer edges for the 2 side pieces. I'll glue on the bottom piece, and then for the top piece, I'm going to use a French pleat style of mounting system. So I will bevel the edge 45 degrees. And then I will cut a corresponding piece using a regular 2x4 with a 45-degree bevel that I will give to the client to screw to the wall. And that will make a really strong mount with the 2 45-degree bevels mating each other. Next, I'll cut out the inlay and then glue it into the edge band. The next day, I cut away the excess and then ran it through the drum sander to reveal the name. And then I glued the front edge band onto the front edge of the shelf. The Cocobolo frame is going to float around the perimeter of the curly maple with a tongue and groove fitting, so I'm using my dado blade to cut the tongue into the curly maple. Normally I just clamp my sacrificial board into my fence, but the clamps would have been in the way. To get around this, I removed the face from my fence and drilled holes into the sacrificial board that lined up with the existing holes along the fence, and then I could screw that board into the fence. I put the fence on the left side of the blade because the table is wider on the right side of the blade, and I needed the support for this large piece. I put the tongue on the maple rather than on the Cocobolo because Cocobolo is much more expensive, and it would have required me to use a wider piece of Cocobolo for the frame pieces. With the edge banding glue dried, I ran the shelf through the drum sander. Next, I cut a groove along the front of the maple for the shelf to fit into. This is about 6 inches down from the exposed top of the maple. I'll trim off the ends of the Cocobolo and then use my dado blade to cut a tongue on the back side of the shelf to fit into that groove. I did that in multiple passes to sneak up on the fit because I want the fit to be very snug. Next, I cut the grooves into the inside edges of the Cocobolo frame pieces. And then I cut 45-degree mitered corners. I was lucky to have just enough Cocobolo for this project. I realized that I had made a mistake with how I cut the tongue because of how it fit at the end. So I had to figure out how I would fix this. I figured out how much material I would need to remove and then cut the tongue to be shallower. And then I used a straight router bit to recut the tongue to be the correct depth to fit into the depth of the groove, but not all the way to the end of the shelf. That way the tongue would not be exposed. Then, with my bandsaw, I carefully trimmed off the remaining tongue at each end of the shelf. The shelf ended up being about a half an inch shallower than I had originally intended, but it wasn't a big issue. I think the final depth was about 6 inches instead of the 6.5 inches that I had planned. And now it fits nicely without having that exposed tongue at the end. Next, I used a 1/16 inch roundover bit along the edges of the shelf before gluing it and the frame pieces in place. Because of the likelihood that this big piece of maple would expand and contract from top to bottom seasonally, I put just a bit of glue in the middle of the two side pieces and no glue at all on the top and the bottom. This will allow the wood to move without cracking anything. The frame pieces are designed so that a portion of the curly maple tongue is exposed. This gives the coat rack some nice dimensionality, and because the curly maple is thicker than the frame pieces, the back of the frame does not touch the wall. I clamped it up and let it sit overnight. The next day, I sanded everything to remove the glue residue and then took it outside to spray it with pre-catalyzed lacquer. This was December 21st, 2023, so there wasn't much time to spare before Christmas. After the finish dried, I screwed in the coat hooks and it was ready for a photo shoot. So I gotta ask, would you make it? After Christmas, the client sent me this video of his girlfriend's parents opening the gift.
Okay, Merry Christmas. Dear Keith and Gina, Christmas is finally here. Last year I spent my first Christmas with your family. Although things may have been different, you guys still kept a smile on your face and remained joyful when I'm sure it wasn't easy. I remember helping decorate the Christmas tree and even making the little gingerbread houses, or at least tried. Those two things, like decorating and Christmas trees, building and gingerbread houses, are things that I never got to do growing up. Although things were different...
You don't have to read it out loud, just read it.
Although things were different, and maybe not quite the same, I can relate to that as well, but in a good way. I can relate to that because I wasn't used to or accustomed to having a place where I didn't feel like a third wheel or a floater. And I want to thank you for having me over last year and including me in your family for Christmas. For making me feel welcome and making me feel like I belonged. Last year, I also promised you that I was making you a Christmas gift because of work and my crazy schedule in ServPro. My late notice for leaving for Maine and for a month and just life, and wasn't able to finish what I was making for you in time. But I didn't forget about you. After about a year, I finally finished. Before you open the gift, I want you to know that I made this because I love you guys and I love your family. And I wanted to make you something that was not only for you, but for your entire family. I hope you always enjoy it, and Merry Christmas. I love you all. All right, you ready? You want to get on that side? What in the world? What did you do? for a year. Oh my God. Oh my gosh.
Oh,
My
that is
gosh.
beautiful.
Will, it is beautiful.
So heavy.
That is absolutely beautiful.
Oh my God. Look at the work in it and the names.
That is gorgeous. It is absolutely gorgeous. That is so beautiful.
You can set things up here and you can hang your coats.
Yes.
Oh my God.
And the little shelf on the top.
So this wood right here is a curly maple, and it's like really refined. And then this right here is the rarest wood. This is called Coca-Cola. It only grows in South America.
That's why it's heavy. It's real dense.
Yeah, it's real dense.
It is gorgeous.
The name,
look at
the
the-
color of
look
the
at the- look at
names
the
is the
green of the
same as
wood.
the color of the wood.
And the name is
How'd you do
stained.
that? You routed it out and then put the
No, that's
piece of wood in it?
no, that's what I went up to
Richmond
for. I had a friend do this for me.
that did the names.
The names.
There's no way I
Wow.
could do that by hand. It's just too precise.
Well, that is so special. Thank you so much.
That is beautiful.
That's a lot of work. And a lot